Welcome to Brite Divinity School's Borderlands Institute Fall Webinar Series entitled Changing the Narrative, Changing Power, Framing Immigration Narratives. My name is Francisco Lozada Jr., and I am the director of the Borderlands Institute at Brite Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. It gives me great pleasure today to host this webinar series and to have with us Dr. Ángel Saavedra Cisneros, Assistant Professor of Government and Legal Studies at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine. Before I introduce Professor Saavedra Cisneros, allow me to thank especially Rowena Tart, the Institute's administrative assistant, who helps tremendously in many ways to put this event together. I would also like to thank others for their guiding support this semester, my colleague, Professor Timothy Sandoval, and Vanessa Daly, Brite's Director of Communication and Marketing. Finally, I want to thank the Luz Foundation for their steadfast support of the Institute and its initiatives. Now, for those who were with us last fall, the webinar series aimed to bring awareness to the very complex issues around borderlands with an eye toward the southern border of the U.S. Last year, we focused on various social factors that pertain to the unique political, social, and religious issues that impact the lives of people on the move. Building on the sharp and insightful remarks from our last year's speakers, whose recordings can be found on Brite's YouTube page, this year the Institute turned its attention on how these factors are rooted in stories, narratives. We began this fall with Natalia Banulescu Bogdan of the Migration Policy Institute, who led us in a discussion on how we talk about migration, followed by Dylan Corbett of the Hope Border Institute on the topic of displacing and generative narratives at the U.S.-Mexico border. Regrettably, because of illness, we were not able to hear Professor Daisy Vargas at the Arizona University on the topic of Latinx religion, respectability, and the law in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. We hope to reschedule this event next semester, but all of these events are now on Brite's YouTube page. Now, for those who are engaged with sacred and non-sacred texts, it's well known that stories are laden with meaning, ethics, points of view to sway you to believe and do. Narratives convey values, construct representations, and communicate positive and negative assumptions and identities about people on the move, all of which influence our transformative social justice thinking and behaviors. Narratives tell us who we are and who we are not, and narratives challenge us to make change or perhaps no change at all. To continue getting us to think about this assertion, we invited Professor Ángel Saavedra Cisneros of Bowdoin College, who focuses on political behavior and racial and ethnic politics. Raised both in the US and Mexico, he completed his Bachelor's of Science in Psychology at Brigham Young University and his PhD in political behavior from Stony Brook University. His expertise is in political psychology and research methodology, as well as political economy. In 2017, his volume, Latino Identity, he published a volume entitled Latino Identity and Political Attitudes, Why Are Latinos Not Republican?, published by Palgrave Macmillan, which I have read and have found it exceptional. The volume won the American Political Science Association's Racial and Ethnic Politics Section Best Book Award for Race and Political Behavior. His current projects involve exploring identity complexity, the development of political identities in multicultural rural settings, and understanding the forces that shape the Latinx vote, as well as immigration attitudes across the Americas. Professor Saavedra Cisneros is new to Brite, but we do have several indirect personal and institutional links. We're both colleagues with Dr. Iracema Coronado at Arizona State University, who led me to his work. We both know a former Brite alum, Benji Douglas, who currently works at Bowdoin, and my daughter Anna is a graduate of Bowdoin as well. Is this providential? For those who are believers, perhaps, and for those who are not, it is just happenstance. Today's presentation is entitled Mi Gente, Latinx Identities in Times of Polarization. Join me today in welcoming Professor Ángel Saavedra Cisneros to our virtual Brite Divinity School. The stage is now yours, Ángel.
Thank you, Francisco. It's a pleasure to be here. This invitation is something that I never expected, and I'm so grateful for this opportunity. And thank you for bringing me in, even if it's virtually. I hope to meet you in person soon. So I have a presentation that I want to share, and to give everyone kind of a background. I'm going to be showing you some numbers first, some figures, and then going through some of the work that I'm doing. I'm going to highlight some of the work that my colleagues are doing too, because I think that there's a lot of value in learning about what other people are doing. The wealth of their work is great. And so I'm trying to highlight a lot of the ideas that help us understand how identities, attitudes, and in particular the question of immigration is politicized. So with that, I'll start just showing you numbers, right? So we know that immigration is being increasingly politicized. We saw that there were talks about caravans and using immigrants as a threat to try to get people to vote one way or another. Even I used to live in Wisconsin. Even Ron Johnson would run ads focused on immigration and the border. And so I want us to think a little bit about, where are we headed? Is this something that are Americans becoming more or less pro-immigration, pro-immigrant? And I think the data that I'll show you actually has some interesting ideas, because it shows that a lot of the rhetoric that we're hearing might just be rhetoric, might be politicized. So to a certain extent, immigrants have been weaponized too, and I want to talk a little bit about what that means. What happens when there are policies that affect immigrants, that target immigrants? There's important effects here that I want us to think about, and then identities, right? So we're getting into the work a little bit that I do, thinking about identities, thinking about how identities shape our beliefs, our attitudes, and then thinking about how we got to where we are and what might be the future of identities, immigration. And by identities, I mean many kinds of identities, not just partisan, not just ethnic, not just religious. And I'm going to kind of hopefully convince you that all of these identities exist in a space that can be overlapping often, and that can result in good things rather than just the bad side of identity politics. So first, numbers, right? This question has been asked by the American National Election Studies for a while now, and this is showing you the trend from 2004 all the way to the 2020. That's the most up-to-date data that we have. And when you ask Americans, do you think, well, how likely is it that immigrants take away jobs? You see that there's a decrease in the people who believe that immigrants take away jobs, right? So this is something important, where we're seeing that there's actually people saying, like, yeah, probably not as likely. The category has doubled. The not likely at all has doubled over the last 20 years. So that's a sign that Americans actually feel that immigrants are not taking away these jobs. So of course, the question is, what is the racial breakdown of this? And here, just showing you non-Hispanic whites, in the middle, African Americans, and on the right hand of your screen, Hispanic or Latino or Latina Americans. And here you see a similar change, right? One of the interesting things is that among African Americans, there's a big reduction in the people who think that immigrants take away jobs, right? So this is a trend that despite what we hear in the news, despite the rhetoric, despite the 2016 election and the people getting elected, we're actually pushing towards in a direction that people feel that immigrants are not necessarily a threat for their job security. What about questions about decreasing or increasing immigration? Here we see a similar trend. Most people actually now, not in the past, but actually prefer to keep immigration at the same level as it is now. What does that mean? It's kind of a status quo answer, saying, well, I don't really know, but sure, let's keep it. But you see a big increase in the percentage of people who want immigration to be increased. And so this is something that might be a reaction to the anti-immigrant rhetoric of Trump, or it might just be a changing in the way we think of immigrants in our country. And again, I'm going to break it down into these two groups. Now I'm focusing on Latinos and Latinas. So people who Latino men, Latino women. There's a small gap, but it's not a huge gap. So as we might expect, women, Latinas tend to be more accepting of immigrants. They want to increase the number of immigrants, Latinos, men, not as much. But you see that they are still a group that supports immigration much more. Now, the last graph that I'm going to show you from the American National Election Study is what we call a feeling thermometer. So when you ask people, how warm or cold do you feel towards this group of people, the A&E asks us a bunch of questions, tons of questions. So this is starting from 88 all the way to 2020. And the question is, has this changed? And you see that it's right around the middle point. So most Americans are actually kind of like lukewarm, maybe, or medium temperature. But when we look at Latinos in this country, we see that it's well above. So with women, with Latinas, it's close to 2/3 of the scale. So yes, much more warmer than colder. With Latinos, with men, how warm do they feel towards immigrants? And here, I didn't explain that. I should have explained. This is illegal immigrants, right? This is not just immigrants. This is people who are defined as entering the country without proper documentation, and the ANES uses the wording illegal immigrants, right? And that's a loaded word. And even among so even with this loaded word, you have that there's people actually liking illegal immigrants more than they would than disliking them. So this is, again, I'm using that term because that's the term that's used in the question, and it's a tough one. We've kind of gone away from using that term. At least I prefer undocumented. Because I know legality is something that is defined pretty awkwardly in this country, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So what are the effects of immigration politics? So we see the attitudes, and I want to kind of focus on the effects of these policies, right? I guess one of the highlight of these policies is SB 1070 in Arizona. Also the Sensenbrenner bill, which will come up a little bit later. That was a bill that was defeated in Congress, but was trying to criminalize immigration, was trying to have really harsh punishments, really bad consequences for what we know is an administrative fault. And so among the work that's been done, some fairly recent work, Rhodes and their colleagues looked at what happens when there's more enforcement of Section 287G, which leads local agencies to cooperate with ICE. What does that have negative effects? It does. It has negative effects on women, on people seeking healthcare, and so there's a direct health effect when there's cooperation with Section 287G. One of my colleagues at UTRGV, so on the southern border, she and her colleagues worked on deportation threat, and they defined it as knowing a deportee or detainee, or also worrying about deportability. And they found that reduces attention to politics and reduces likelihood of voting. So this has a negative impact on people who actually might be linked to people who are immigrants, right? And so just the threat of this makes you less likely to participate politically. And then more recently, and I'll show you the cover of their book in a second, Huo and their colleagues actually find that the policies at the state level, so they compare New Mexico and Arizona, when there is a policy that actually welcomes immigrants, people tend to have better affect, and I'll explain affect in a second. So here what they're doing is they're exploring positive affect, so good feelings. Rather than tell us about individual emotions, they look at positive emotions like hope, and then negative emotions, sad, angry. They invert that, right? So they create a scale for positive affect. So what is the impact of being in a hostile versus a welcoming state? And here they separate foreign-born Latinos, U.S.-born Latinos, and U.S.-born whites. And what they find is that living in a welcoming place actually increases positive affect across all different groups. There's one exception, right? And I'll get to that in a second. But U.S.-born Latinos, foreign-born Latinos, and U.S.-born white non-Hispanic people actually have much more positive affect in general when they live in a state that is welcoming to immigrants, in this case, New Mexico, compared to Arizona. The one exception is conservatives, right? So conservative whites. So conservative whites do have more positive affect when they live in a kind of anti-immigrant state. And so this is their book. This is an article. I'm showing you the Proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences article findings. But they wrote a book about this, States of Belonging. It's a wonderful book. And this really kind of highlights what the impact of immigration policies are on attitudes and inclusion. And we really focus on inclusion now, I think in our circles, because we want to make people feel welcome. We want to make them feel like they belong. And so this book is one of those books that I read recently, and is one that is worth digging into and thinking about what are the effects, not just on the immigrants, but on the communities within a state or a community when there are laws that are anti-immigrant. Like, what happens there? So now I want to show you kind of the politicization of immigration, and I can't ask you right now what do you think, but we'll get to that later when we have the Q&A. But I'll show you an ad from a recent campaign, and I'll tell you what happened in that congressional election, and then tell you about the effects of this. So Clayton, we're ready for that video.
When you love something, it's worth protecting. I'm Monica de la Cruz, and I love America. As a mom, I teach my kids to follow the rules, just as my grandmother did when she legally immigrated from Mexico. But Joe Biden abandoned us and our border, transforming our country with drugs, gangs, and violence. I'm Monica de la Cruz, and I approve this message because, unlike Joe Biden, I believe America is worth protecting.
Republican Monica de la Cruz for Congress.
So this, in me, evokes a lot of what we call negative affect. So there's a lot of emotions for me that are coming from this ad. So Monica de la Cruz actually won her race in South Texas. It's a pretty gerrymandered district, so it goes all the way from the border up around the eastern suburbs of San Antonio. So she won, not by a lot, but she beat the Democratic person who was running. There was a new district. So did this have a successful effect politically? Maybe, but what does this do to, like, what do these types of ads do to Latinos? And there's some interesting research coming out, and this is from the Brookings Institution. Gabe Sanchez and Carly Bennett have shown that there's negative effects, increased negative affect when people are aware of these ads, right? And so we live in immigrant communities. A lot of us actually have family or friends who might be immigrants, who might be undocumented, and so this actually has a pretty bad effect to Latinos' mental health, like to the group's mental health. And this is, however, for most politicians, this isn't a consideration, right? The consideration is, am I going to win? And how do you win in a heavily Latino district? Some of these messages might actually resonate with some people, and hopefully in the next couple of slides, I'll try to unpack with which people it might work, which it won't, and why. Like, what are the reasons why these things might work? So we've heard of identity politics. This is something that kind of comes and goes in our international lore. And we use it a lot, right? And it has different meanings. Sometimes it's seen as a way to, like, exclude people. Sometimes it used to be kind of a euphemism for minority politics, right? But now we know that there's identity politics used everywhere in all contexts. And these identities can drive our behavior. And so the traditional model is to think of ourselves in a different identity in a different place, and they're separate, right? But this doesn't make that much sense, because we have lots of identities at any given moment. We're drawing on our identities, right? When you go out into the store, when it's a Sunday, are you wearing a Texans jersey? Are you wearing a Cowboys jersey? Something as silly as that, but that's your identity, right? You put on a different identity, and that's your Sunday identity. Or what church do you go to? How do you dress to go to church? All of these things are considerations that are related to our identity. So identities are not fixed. They're not just separate. And here I'm showing you a graph that shows up in my book a little bit, but it's one of these projects that I'm trying to work on. And it really is kind of repeating the work that my colleague Heather Silber Mohammed has done, and it suggests that when we had these massive national marches in 2006 advocating for pro-immigration reform, something happened. And so I'm on the left-hand side, the first three sets of columns is an identity scale that I created, and then each of those columns tells you a different time frame. So the time frame, one of the interesting things about this data set is that it started to be collected in 2005, before the marches started. Then we had the rise of the marches in the spring of 2006, and this data set didn't finish collection until right before the 2006 election. And so we have different time points where we see these identities kind of be changed maybe or activated based on the marches. And the finding, the expectation was that pan-ethnic identity would increase, that because of these marches, they were trying to say, hey, we're all American, we belong, we would see an increase in pan-ethnic identity. That didn't happen. Right? That's on the far right. You'll see these three columns flat. No effects there. What about your country of origin? If they make you, one of the beliefs is that if you feel more American, you're going to feel less like you belong in your country that you came from. And we see very little change there. But what we do see is a change in American identity. So this is telling us that these identities are not either or, right? So we Latinos in this survey actually have all three identities. Some people were not identifying as American, and you can see that those are the lowest values here, but over time it increases. Right. So during the marches, there's an increase in our identity as American, and the other identities do not suffer from this increase. So this is what real identity politics kind of looks like, right? We have the self, and the self is embedded in some identities. Some identities crisscross, other identities don't. Other identities are embedded within each other. So if you think about being a Latino in this country, you kind of have to have an identity of, okay, where does my Latinidad come from? Am I a Tejano? Am I a Boricua? Am I a Charrua? Am I a Mexican? Like, what am I, right? But that kind of encompasses in Latino. And if you think, okay, that's part of a bigger identity, well, yeah, what is a bigger identity? Like, are you Latino-Americano? Are you American, U.S. citizen? These are identities that can work together for actually good effects rather than just effects of separating people. So there's different ways of naming these things. And one of the things that has happened is that we've transitioned from the traditional model, those separate little circles that I showed you, to what we think sometimes as a compartmentalized identity, or maybe a hyphenated identity, where you exist at the intersection of these two identities. And in my current and future work, I'm hoping to say, I'm hoping to explore what the change is when you think of yourself as being both, like all three, right? The intersection, or maybe just one, or maybe the other. When you have this sense of what we call a complex identity, you're actually better able to navigate different contexts. You're less reactive to threat. You actually see more commonality. And so I want to try to explore this in future work to better understand what is it about people who see themselves as all of the above rather than just one, or only the intersection. And this is what I'm hoping. This is not my original thought. It comes from psychologists, from social psychologists, but it's something that I think will help us better understand politics, and in particular the politics of immigration and the politics of identities and Latinos in this country. So here I'm going to show you some tables, and bear with me. This is very technical political science, and I'm sorry. But what I wanted to do in my book is I wanted to see what types of identities, and I was looking at two particular identities. So Latino identity, pan-ethnic identity, that's the focus of my book. But I also wanted to look at religious identity. And religious identity is tricky in political science because sometimes we use your affiliation. Sometimes we say, well, no, that's not an identity. Sometimes we look at religiosity. So does religiosity change the way you think about politics? Yes, it does. And what I found in my work was that focusing on born again or charismatic Christians among the Latino population was actually a way to understand their behaviors. And when I was reading this, I was really unaware of how strong of a movement the charismatic Catholic or the born again Latinos were in this country. In the data set that I have, it was over 30% of the sample actually identifying as either born again or charismatic. So it's not an insignificant group. It's a group that is in that data set 1/3. We know that Latinos secularize over time, but still it's important. So when looking at immigration issues, which is the focus of this talk, we see that only Latino identity has an effect. So there's no effect of religiosity or being born again. And I'm going to try to break that up in a few slides from now, but I want to focus on these identities for a second, right? So what happens if we actually say, that people who are in this country for longer are less likely to support immigration? Is this true? And we see that over here on these coefficients on the right-hand side towards the bottom, the bolded ones. So people who have been in this country second, third generation, they're less supportive of immigration, as expected. But people who have a high sense of Latino identity, Latino solidarity, they are more supportive of immigration. And you might say, well, why is there a negative sign there? And I apologize, but that negative sign is just a way to say, if you go towards the left, you're more liberal. If you go towards the right, you're more conservative. So the negative pushes you towards the liberal side. And the question that hadn't been asked was, well, what happens when you mix identity and time in the U.S.? Will we see a shift in the way that you translate your identity as you are more embedded in the American system? And here we have these coefficients that show us that being in this country for longer, actually, second, third generation, and it also works for immigrants, time in the U.S., that you are better able to translate your identity, in this case, your ethnic identity, into more support for immigration over time, right? So this is something that is not unique, but it suggests that Latino identity actually has an impact that is stronger for people who are second and third generation. If you have a strong sense that you identify with other Latinos, you're more likely to support immigration than if you are third generation than if you are first generation. This is just the graph showing you how this works, right? So you have the 3 lines. I apologize for stuff on the left-hand side. There's something wrong with the code there. But you see that there's a decreasing line. So as you identify more strongly, you are more supportive of immigration, and that the effect is different. And people who are born in this country to US-born parents are more likely to use their Latino identity or Latinx identity to inform their immigration views. So again, I mentioned Dr. Heather Silver Mohammed, and her work, The New Americans, basically is this second panel where she's looking at American identity, and she found that over the course of the marches, more Latinos identified as Americans because they were able to translate their movement, their social movement, into one that said we belong, and we want to come out of the shadows, and we want to make sure that you understand that we are also Americans. And this is a really good book that I had the privilege of reading and reviewing. And if you're interested in the effects of these marches, right, they actually do make people more American. They don't make them more like anti-American. It's the opposite effect as some people would have expected. So we're going to shift to religion, and I talked a little bit about religion, before. What were did being evangelical matter or going to church more matter for Latinos? It didn't really, because Latinos are very supportive of immigration. But now there's some work. So Ben Knoll has done a lot of work on support or opposition to immigration, and he found that the Jewish and LDS Americans are more supportive of pathways towards legalization. But more recently, from the American Community Survey, we have this data. Ryan Burge is on Twitter. He has really interesting religion figures that he shares. So I don't know him personally, but he's pretty. He shares some really interesting things. So we know that LDS people, Latter-day Saints or Mormons, tend to be very conservative in their politics. They vote Republican often. And the question that a lot of people are asking is like, well, do they behave like other evangelicals and other things? And here you see that these gaps that you see between white evangelicals, which are the blue bars, and LDS, white LDS, the red bars, that they are pro-immigration, significantly more pro-immigration across a series of questions. So, sorry, I said the American Bailiff Survey is not. Sorry, this is the CES data. And so you see that LDS people are much more supportive of immigrants, and the question is probably why. Why, even though they behave very conservatively when it comes to politics, they are much more supportive of immigration. And here are some examples, right? So why, on the right-hand side, you have things, some posts from Catholics, which we expect them to be much more pro-immigration, much more pro the poor. And on the left-hand side, you have a screenshot from one of the from the immigration resource from the Mormon Church, where they have welcoming centers, where they tell people, hey, you are welcome here. They actually had press releases saying we support immigration, broadly speaking, right? Not just saying, oh, we only approve legal immigration. It was a very broad support for immigration. And this shows that these religious identities can push people to actually say, you know what? Yes, we support immigrants. I mean, there are biblical reasons for this, but oftentimes religions don't actually care that much about what they're reading when it translates into political policies, because our political identities are really strong today. So there's good work suggesting that political identities are driving a lot of even our religious identities now. So the idea that we use our religious beliefs to guide our politics has now been upended a little bit, where we use our political beliefs to guide our non-political life. So I'm going to show you a little bit of the ugly, and the ad from South Texas was, in my opinion, kind of ugly. Really showing these exclusionary images and talking about exclusion. But we don't just have this in the United States. Right, so this happened in 2018, 2020, when there was a Republican push to try to say, oh, there's caravans of migrants coming, and we need to make sure that they don't make it to the border. But in Mexico, we reacted too. And this was something that really shocked me. And there's good colleagues doing work there, but the work in Mexico is still kind of in its infancy. So there was this report that a lady said that she didn't like what she was being fed, trying to get from the southern Mexico border to the northern Mexico border. And there was a huge backlash. And I saw this even on my own. I don't know any of the people who posted here, but these are like actual posts. Like they actually were making fun of migrants who are risking their lives to try to come and live the American dream. And there was a huge anti-immigrant backlash. And I saw that the rhetoric that worked for Americans was working in Mexico. And sometimes in the United States, we use like, well, maybe there's a racial identity to explain this. But in Mexico, racial identity wouldn't make that much sense. So this is something that really troubled me. And I'm hoping to learn more about why it is that even, Latinos, Mexicanos, are so reactive to this kind of exclusionary language and to these narratives that the people who are not coming to do anything bad, but actually just trying to get to the United States. The question why, I think, because I'm a political psychologist, I want to suggest that there are psychological predispositions here, in particular authoritarianism as a predisposition, maybe not. Is there a lack of reputable information? And here you see this is the chart that comes from the American Value Survey, and they ask people, do you believe that all three core tenets of QAnon? And you see that the third group most likely to believe it is Hispanic Catholic. So Latinos who are Catholic are they're in the top three of groups that believe all core tenets of QAnon, right? So it is interesting to try to think about what's going on here, and why is it that people who probably we wouldn't expect to be these reactionary and to exclude other people are actually listening to these messages. So the question, why support, why oppose? I think there's a lot of different ways to think about this. Some professors at UTEP, along with a Michigan professor, wrote this book very recently, which tries to propose the concept of group empathy. Maybe it's group empathy that makes people work together and help others who might not be in your own group. But of course, because I work on identities, I'm fascinated by the question of identities. So there's a good, very accessible book by two social psychologists, Jay Van Bavel and Packer, and they suggest that we can use our identities and bigger identities, like we belong, to actually help us deal with threats and actually make sure that these threats do not create division, but rather help us join with others. Efrain Perez, who's a professor at UCLA, he actually wrote a book where he suggests that in this country, we have this sense of minority identity, and that maybe that's how we actually are more welcoming to other groups. And of course, there's the other identity. Why do people oppose immigration? Why do people not like immigrants? And there's a sense that maybe there's a white identity here, that there's lots of reasons for this. But Abrajano and Hajnal actually wrote this book, White Backlash, a while ago, suggesting that the threat of immigrants is something that makes whites react. So what I want us to think about is, how do we move forward, right? Just sharing a space with others who are different doesn't make us reduce this negativity, doesn't make us more willing to accept immigrants. And this goes back all the way to Gordon Allport and his context hypothesis over 60 years ago. And we know we're polarized. We get these messages, and some of these messages are exclusionary. So how do we move from that idea of getting exclusionary messages to actually create a sense of community. And this image that I'm showing is some pro-immigrant marches when we've had ICE raids, Immigration and Customs Enforcement raids on communities. We see that there's actually a strong community support, not just from the migrant communities, but from the non-migrant communities to say, no, you can't do this in our hometown. And the extreme version of this is when activists rally and come around an ICE van and say, you're not taking anybody, right? So hopefully we don't have to get to that point, but how do we help people feel like we want to bring in our brothers and sisters from all over the world, rather than say, yeah, maybe they're a threat. There's lots of possibilities. Is it identity? Is there empathy? What else can we do? And that's the final thought that I want to leave you with here. Thank you.
On there. Okay, there we go. Okay, thank you, Professor. There's a lot of information. I'll get started with the line of questions here, and I see already some people are beginning to have some questions for you as well. I don't know where to begin because there's a lot of information there. There's an anecdote. There's part of me that's a little anecdotal because when you present your data, I cannot help not to think about my own self of identity. As a Catholic, as someone who's affiliated with the parents who are affiliated with the charismatic movement within Catholicism, I get all that. And I can see some of the links. I'm also born in the U.S. My parents were not, but I still have this sense of memory of them and the all that comes with moving from one place to another, both physically but also spiritually in many ways. I want to go back to there's a number of it, but I'm gonna just ask one and then get to the others other questions. But you had a graph earlier on in the presentation on evangelicals and LDS, and correct me on some of this, on how they had a much more positive affect on welcoming. Is there anything in the data? Do you delve more into the why in the sense of theology? I know this may not be in your realm of things in many ways, but as someone who plays theologian at many times, I cannot help to think that there's a link there in terms of the welcoming. I mean, in Catholicism, I know it's part of their Catholic social teachings. And that would be something espoused, but it's not espoused by all Roman Catholics, and it's not espoused lately. I think I would argue that among white Roman Catholics, they've had a negative affect towards welcoming. But I don't know. Have you seen more data on the why? I guess in that sense.
Yeah, and here I might not have a theological in, but more of a historical, political in. So the LDS Church started in New York, right? And so they were pushed out from many places and threatened and persecuted. And so they, I think in the story of the LDS Church, they feel as if they're migrants, kind of. They're going from place to place. And finally settle in Utah, in what was Mexico. And they finally were like, okay, here we are, because nobody wanted that place. Like, well, this is a salt lake. It's not going to do anything. You guys are going to die. And so that's part of the history of the LDS Church. And also the LDS Church is a very global church. So they do missionary work all over the world. But the belief in I guess there is some theology, is that the dispensation will come to the United States. Right. So you want to bring people in who you've converted, who are now Mormons, to come and be in the United States for when the last coming of Christ happens. So I think that's it's the idea that they also read the Bible. Yes, they have a history of this, but they also believe that by welcoming more people, they are better able to serve the souls of the people who they're trying to get to the celestial kingdom.
Yeah, and I suspect with Judaism is and again, I don't want to speak in a homogeneous way for Judaism, because I think varies on one's religious perspectives on it. I suspect it has to do with the strong motif of one is their history, but also the motif of migration over the years. And the more you distance yourself from that history, it's perhaps it moves into a different negative sort of affect in many ways. I have more questions. We were chatting before all this, and I'll respect my role as host and move on to some of the questions here. And if there are not any, then I'll continue with some questions here. But the first question, let me there you go. I'm going to show it to you. Is in a recent blog post, political scientist Adrian Pantoja makes the claim based on polling data that as it relates to Latino religiosity, the dramatic development is that Latinos are embracing secularism that aligns or with notions of political socializations, that is voting, citizenship, and the becoming more American. Any thoughts?
Yeah. So secularism, the way we're defining it, and Adrian Pantoja's work is really insightful too, and using really good data, is that they're less likely to go to church, right? So by this secularism, they're becoming less Catholic. And so I think what's happening here is this idea that traditionally Republicans would think that Latinos are, they're Republican, to quote the old saying, they're Republicans, but just don't know it, was based on kind of these traditional religious beliefs. But what we're seeing is that actually the secularism doesn't make Latinos change that much in their attitudes, and in fact, they become, well, I guess they do. They're becoming more supportive of abortion and more supportive of gay marriage, and so that happens. But it doesn't affect attitudes towards immigration or attitudes towards economic policy. So the secularism shows itself in less attendance in church, but I think it doesn't show itself in like exclusionary policies. And so here it's interesting to think about. And Francisco, you were mentioning that what is our familial history in religion, right? What is the Catholic version that we grew up in? Did we go to a very progressive or a very Teología de la Liberación kind of place, or did we grow up in a traditionalist kind of church? And we don't know, right? So the secularization of Latinos could have effects that push people in either direction based on kind of where what your understanding of religion is.
Can you say anything about second and third generation shifts towards increasing Latino identity? Is it religious and again secular? And I would even add, I think it's the same question I just had after your response. I was thinking, well, better articulated here. Wondering, and I can't help to think of my children's generation in some of this. Why are they tend to be more positive, have a positive affect as opposed to other Latinos, Latinas, Latinx folks of the same generation?
Yeah, there's a lot of possibilities here, and so one is, well, context matters, right? Who is it that you're hanging out with? Like, are you more likely to have a community through church, a community where you hear prayers in the same language? Are you more likely to connect to people from Peru, Ecuador, even if you're, let's say, Puerto Rican, Mexican, right? Is this, that does increase your sense of Latino identity, right? So let's say you live in a place that's very rich in its Latino heritage, a place that has people from all over Latin America. You might actually find more connections if you're like second, third generation, because you guys go to the same schools, you speak English, you don't all like just hang out with your families, but you're actually more embedded in the community. So this is probably why we see second, third generation effects. There are some interesting books where we've found that second generation Latinos actually have kind of a downward shift in economic, social, political outcomes, and then it rebounds. And so I do wonder, like, what is the role of the Latino community in context, right? Like, context is so important. If you grow up in LA, it's a very, very different context than if you grow up, well, I don't even have to go out of Texas, right? If you grow up in Houston, San Antonio, Dallas, like, it's a super different context in which you're developing your sense of who are my people, right? And I guess the question, mi gente, right? Like, who are my people and how does this develop over time? Not a good answer, I'm sorry, but like, there's lots of factors and socialization processes happening.
I'm sorry about that. I'll turn to another question, and it's somewhat related to what you did earlier, how you responded earlier. But let me add to something to this as well, and it sort of connects with this sense of, I think, encounter. I think it's also deals with the question of location. But I'll go ahead and read the question. Let me post it here. The role of missions within the LDS Church has given the Mormons a high percentage of adherents returning from abroad, where they have learned languages and really met others from host countries. One of my best friends is married to a Venezuelan woman, they met 25 years ago on a mission. What might be done to encourage and enable more Americans to live and work abroad, even if not as a missionary? And again, I think this goes back to something that was said earlier in one of the webinars in terms of contact. That is, people who had contact with people of either first generation, second generation migrants had it would help with breaking down some barriers in terms of understanding where they come from, the trials and tribulation when it comes to migration as well. Is that something that your data has also sort of supported?
Not my data per se, but like other work suggests that the type of contact is important, right? So this white savior complex is something that is important, because if you have this contact with people in other countries or even locally, and you always see them as inferior, and you providing for them and you giving them services, then this actually might exacerbate the divisions and the distinction, right? So I think that there's some pretty good data that suggests that in order for this contact to have a good effect, you have to be equals, right? You have to be seeing each other as equals, not in somebody serving another person. And because if you create these hierarchies, these disparities, then you actually don't have the coming together. And to think about meeting people, yeah, that's important. But again, what are you talking about? What are you discussing is central. And to focus on the getting people to go abroad, this is something that I believe very strongly in, and I've always wanted to take students abroad. But it's not easy. One, costs, right? So if more Americans could go abroad, yes. But second, like, how many of us want to go and have a rough experience versus go on vacation, right? When you go on vacation, the people are making you feel happy. You're not really engaging with the society. And so I keep thinking about what kind of trip would be a good trip. I just recently went to Israel and Palestine, and it was not as a tourist, but it was as a learning trip. And it was put together by our Peace and Justice Center at St. Norbert College, where I was before here. And it was wonderful because I learned a lot. I learned a lot, but I know less. So I have more information, but I'm more aware of really the intricacies and all these nuances that are hard to gauge from far away. So I try to create study abroad groups at my previous institution. One of these courses was going to take students to the southern border. We were going to start in Arizona, then kind of go to the border, experience some things, and then finish up in an Norbertine Abbey in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I only had 3 students sign up, right? So yes, it's a small liberal arts college, 2,000 students, but it's religious. And I had hoped that a lot of us would be interested in learning about the border, learning about policies, learning about the people, and then reflecting on it, through the religious institution. And it was really it was personally devastating that we only had 3 people show up. because the costs were not that much, but we couldn't have the course happen because with 3 you can't make you can't provide everything that we wanted to. And so I think that we can provide opportunities, and the hard part is the people who are unlikely to want to engage with the other are also unlikely to want to go abroad and learn about other people. So this is something that I really struggle with, and I wish there were a way to really help people feel like they can go abroad. And that's why I think the missionary, even if you're painting a church for the 10th time, kind of helps, because it gives people a purpose to go abroad. And so that's, I wish there was more of this, because if we did intercultural exchange where we actually see each other as equals, we might actually learn from more people by meeting them and by saying, we're all humans.
Let me, you got me thinking a little bit about the more recent events, our midterm elections here. Is anything that you've, and of course, we're all waiting for the data to come out from the exit polls and whatnot. Are you working with any sort of hypothesis based on what just happened? I mean, I saw one poll saying that immigration wasn't as a big issue as they thought it would be.
Right.
So any reflection on that?
Yeah, and I might show my colors here. So immigration tends to be used as like a threat thing. So when you want your nationalist core of people to vote for one party, you present, immigration as a threat. But right now they have a threat, right? Right now there's a threat of high inflation, of high gas prices. And so they didn't need to draw upon that. I think on the other side of the aisle, we have, decades of nothing happening in Congress for immigration reform. Like DACA is basically expired. And when I learn of students who grew up in this country but don't have proper documentation, I feel so powerless. And I tell them, well, Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency for 2 years, and we didn't have a change. So I think Democrats want to say that they are pro-immigration, but at the national level, it's hard to prove that. Obama deported the most, and then Biden is keeping these restrictionist policies in place whenever the Biden administration feels like it. So I think that's why Democrats shy away from the issue. Republicans didn't really need to use it, and because we had other concerns, right? We had other issues that came to the top, and Latinos don't always think about immigration. It's something that many of us do, but some say, well, some actually say, I'm not an immigrant. Why would you ask me about that? Because I was born in this country. So I think it's a thorny issue for Democrats, and Republicans didn't need to activate it.
What has been your experiences working? This goes back to earlier your presentation about places, the data that show that places that were more welcoming were also tend to be more open-minded towards the question of migration. But would you? I mean, I guess I was thinking of Florida here, but Florida is not the great example here. Recently, with the shifting, but there's Cuban Americans there, there's Venezuelans, there's Puerto Ricans, there's a whole. I mean, it's a little Latin America in many certain sections of Florida. The ads are in Spanish and whatnot. They even use native speakers from Venezuela to do these ads, or native speakers of Cuba, or that sort of thing. But it doesn't, that notion, in DFW, in the DFW area, we work on this in terms of making DFW a more welcome place. Many of the churches are affiliated with Brite in some way or the other have contacted me on terms of how we do this sort of thing. But how does it, I mean, when you reflect on Florida or Texas, that sort of thing, what comes to mind?
Well, I think there's several things, right? First, I think that there are personality level predispositions. So if you think of the people who left Cuba, who left Venezuela to come to Miami, they represent a particular part of that population. It wasn't like we randomly sampled Cubans and randomly sampled Venezuela and say, hey, now you live in Florida, right? So that, I think that's why, because
Mhm.
they're self-selected to live there. I think in Texas it might be similar. And so the first thing is, I do think that there's sorting among people. We live in places where we feel like
Mm.
we belong more, where we have neighbors that we like. So that is part of it. I also think that there's these predispositions. Like, if you don't like liberal policies, you're probably not going to live in a liberal area, right? And so
Mm.
that might
Mhm.
be part of it. Although Miami-Dade, that was kind of a shock. I was actually very interested by the Puerto Rican numbers, right? So Cubans,
Mhm. Right.
vote conservative, but Puerto
Yeah.
Ricans, there was a strong advantage for voting, at least for DeSantis. But then again, DeSantis is an incumbent,
Yeah.
and people like his
Yeah.
government. So that's part of what's
Mhm.
going on.
Mhm.
And yeah, and last, I find this paradoxical. When this country says Venezuela is a terrible place because of communism, and then we don't welcome Venezuelans trying to leave,
Mhm.
but rather
Mhm.
use them for political stunts. That I don't understand that. Like, and I really,
Mhm.
I don't have. I'm hoping to. So that's on the docket for what I'm working on in the future, because I'm
Mhm.
curious. Like, why is it that these things, that we don't see the connection between being a place that says we want to welcome people who are fleeing a communist place, but then at the same time saying, like, oh, we don't want you either.
Mhm. Mhm. Let me ask another question here, because I'm curious to get your reaction towards as well, because you're seeing the data a lot. I get accused a lot, not accused, but students always say it's so pessimistic. It's nothing's working. We're working hard. We're not doing, nothing's changing. And they always push me to give them some hope. Provide some hope to their work. They're all very committed to social justice. They want to bring in more of an inclusive community. What is there anything in your work that gives you hope? I mean, that leads you to say, things are, this what churches are doing or religious communities are doing, what social justice, youth, or younger generation are doing, it's working, maybe not working. What would change it? Is there anything that comes to mind on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is both hopeful and not hopeful, but um, like, the work is being done, right? And you see the work happening grassroots, right? It's people who care, it's people who spend time doing this, and I think that those books that I shared, not the White Backlash, but the other ones, um, they
Mhm.
they are hopeful, because they see that through these organic processes where people working together for common goal,
Mhm.
being creating these bridging bonds across groups that maybe they didn't think of before, the work is getting done. Then politics comes in, right? And maybe the government is not doing what a lot of us would want them to do on the terms of immigration, helping the poor, helping the needy. But I
Mhm.
feel that is a source of positive energy when you see people from all walks of life coming out and helping. And so I think that the 2006 marches were one example, right? And then we have other types of questions that actually showed up, and other types of movements where we see people like, yes, we're working together. Of course, there's sometimes bad stuff like we saw in LA, but there is the
Mhm.
possibility, and we are becoming more likely to work with people who we might not have worked with in the past. So that, I think that's hopeful, right? Because our identities are
Mhm.
shifting, and we're not being like, oh, well, I feel like I'm a Latino, and so I can only work with Latinos, right? But we're actually growing our sphere of comfort. By doing
Mhm.
that, we're linking with other spheres of influence, and then being
Mhm.
able to make some change.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, there's a volume that I use in class, by Natalia Molina, on how racism is made in the U.S. and
Yeah.
um, and I've always found it very helpful, and I introduced it to my students because I think what Molina does there is links uh, Latina X identity history with other groups, particularly the African American, Asian American groups as well, even including white society in general, and showing how we're all actually very connected in many different ways, that you can't understand today's issues without understanding the past and whatnot. So that's what I aim to do a little bit there as well, besides some sort of theological constructions on hope as well, that particularly is drawn by Latin American liberation theologians and whatnot. But anyway, I was just wondering, because we're doing this sort of work, and sometimes you do leave a class and you're very quite pessimistic about it and whatnot. So it's not very hopeful for the future. But I want to thank you for taking the time today to present to us your work, your ideas, your reflections. All of that has been great. You've given us a lot of material. I've already got some comments about wanting your book list. And I can probably put that together for them as well. But again, I want to thank you again for taking the time to chat with us today at Brite Divinity School, and hopefully we can be in contact in the future again, physically.
Yeah, hopefully. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Take care.